So this Saturday we have yet another title unification, this time in the welterweight division between IBF and WBC champion Errol Spence Jr. and WBA champion Yordenis Ugas. This is likely to be a career-defining fight for both men, and in my opinion, it has all the makings of an intriguing and closely contested fight. To start with Yordenis Ugas, he is currently riding the crest of a wave after dethroning a legend in Manny Pacquiao in his last fight in August last year, and he of course won the WBA super title for his efforts. Ugas stylistically is a bit of an odd fighter, I think. He has I want to say surprising lack of mobility for a Cuban fighter. Instead of opting to move quite generously like we see with many Cuban fighters, he just moves just enough, no more than he needs to. And he looks to edge forward using a slow but steady pressure, using a probing jab to get reaction from his opponent, and he seems partial when that reaction comes to counter with body shots in particular. And this is something that he does to decent effect. If you watch his fights, it's something that he's able to do with regularity. I think overall, Ugas is a very strong and imposing fighter with that slow and steady pressure, but also his physical strength. And he has an underrated ability to counterpunch. I think he's very sharp on the counter, and you can see when he's looking at his opponent and he's throwing out that jab and he's edging forward, he's just waiting for a reaction because he knows that as soon as it comes, he's going to be on him. Ugas does have shortcomings, however. Of course, every fighter has shortcomings. When I look at Ugas, the primary shortcoming I see is maybe some lack of consistency in his active guard, and this results in him not always giving his opponent different looks and becoming a static target. However, he does actually make use of an active guard, and when he does, he really goes through the gears, and you can see he's thinking about what can he see, what can he set up. For my money though, it's just sometimes he switches off a little bit and he can resort to just kind of maybe plodding forward in a straight line, not coming off the center line, not really manipulating his hand positioning. So that's the first shortcoming I see in Ugas. Secondly, is that you can see this straight away. Ugas seems to be quite front foot heavy. You'd often see breakdowns back in the day of people deciphering Mayweather's pull counter. And when Mayweather puts the weight on his front leg and he looks to bait you in so then he can pull back, load up the right hand, and then shoot forward again. Ugas is always in that front foot position, or most of the time he's in that front foot position, which has got most of the weight on that foot. And he rarely transfers his weight to the back half of his stance. And so what that means from a technical and biomechanical point of view is he doesn't really have much of a left hook. And you can see this a lot of the time where even if he attempts a left cross or a left hook or any kind of left-handed power punch, he'll often only make it back to the middle of his stance. And you can see that there's just a bit more space that he can use to get some extra power and extra snap in the punch. So yeah, it can lead to Ugas being a little bit one-handed. He does seem to favour the right hand as a power punch. But as long as he can set it up, that's not necessarily a problem. But from a fighter of the highest level, you'd like to see a bit more diversity in the arsenal. But that's kind of an overview of Yordenis Ugas. Moving on to Errol Spence. Now, he's seen as either the number 1 or number 2 at welterweight, and of course is the reigning IBF and WBC champ, and is coming off a relatively straightforward victory over Danny Garcia from December 2020. Spence himself is another big, strong, imposing welterweight, probably the biggest guy in the division at the highest level. He has a good variety of punches that he uses to the head, but famously for the body, Spence does have a good ability to attack the body. I've seen him break down many guys going to the body. But no punch really stands out as his kind of go-to money punch. And I personally think this is a symptom of Spence not having the most complete punching mechanics. often when Spence goes to punch and really punch hard, he remains on the centre line, and it results in less power generation just from a technical point of view, but also himself being a less dynamic target. And the thing is with Spence, it's like he throws every shot well, like every shot's like a 70%, but he doesn't have one shot, or he's not able to turn his shots up to like 90% or 100%. He's not like a proper, true one-punch KO artist. And now he could still probably knock you out, you know, ask Leonard Bondu, because he was flat on his back in 2016. But for the most part, Errol Spence, he doesn't land those kind of shots very often. Spence is the kind of guy who throws all of his shots from round 1 to round 12, if you make it that far, with a good kind of even power. But no shot is particularly dangerous. Yeah, he goes to the body well, but he goes to the head well, hooks, uppercuts, sometimes the straight shots. Yeah, there's no one standout shot for my money. I think when I give an overall assessment of Spence, he's quite a basic fighter. You know, you assess him, you assess his skill set, you observe what he does, and he doesn't really do anything too advanced. You know, he relies on the jab, the right jab from a southpaw stance to set up his power punches, to be defensively responsible. Sometimes he moves his head off, but most of the time it's just a high guard for defense or a little step back. He's not the kind of fighter who uses a lot of feints or switches up his setup, you know, rather than always setting up the left with the right hand, he set up the right with the left hand. He doesn't really use advanced footwork. He's not, you know, for someone who's a southpaw and a long and some would say rangy southpaw because of his size and his dimensions, he doesn't really seem, he's not like the kind of headache southpaw, you know, because there are some southpaws and they really utilize getting angles and they understand how to work around an orthodox opponent. Spence isn't that kind of guy. For the most part, he's going to be in front of you. But I think Spence's biggest asset, and this sounds like a little bit of a cop-out and a little bit of a, I don't know, shade I'm throwing at Spence trying to detract from him, but it's really his size. I think his size and his strength and his overall athleticism is his greatest strength. And I watched the Danny Garcia fight, and as I said previously, that fight was relatively straightforward for Spence, but there were numerous kind of flashes and occasions where Danny Garcia proved to be, you know, he proved to have a lot higher IQ than Errol Spence. He was able to quite easily time Errol Spence. His positioning relative to Errol Spence was more diverse. He had a greater greater selection of shots available to him. He set up his shots with a bit more sophistication. And Errol Spence, he looked basic at times. However, the size difference between those two was immediately apparent. And sometimes Errol Spence was just able to shut down Danny Garcia, or he was just able to get out of range. Danny Garcia has famously come up from 140. And he's not the biggest guy in terms of dimensions. He's got quite a thick-set, stocky build almost, but he doesn't necessarily have the longest arms. He's not necessarily the quickest, but for my money, he displayed that he can think. He has a bit more of an advanced understanding of boxing than Errol Spence. And now, I know this sounds like I'm detracting from Errol Spence, but don't just listen to what I say. Even Spence's own trainer, Derek James, calls him basic. He called Spence basic. He called him methodical, even called him slow. And, you know, Hatman did a video on this so you can see for yourself. You can see the article for yourself. That's his own trainer saying it. So I don't think I can be construed as a hater for saying the same thing. Because it's true, Spence is a basic fighter. But he's got a consistent work rate. He's a big guy, he's a strong guy, he's imposing, and he's a good athlete. So you can kind of understand how he'd get away with having maybe mediocre skills when he's against people who are so much smaller than him, or at least considerably smaller than him. But is Danny Garcia Yordenis Ugas? I think they're quite different opponents. They bring different things to the table. Now, speaking of Spence and Ugas, both of these guys understand the dynamics of fighting someone the opposite stance. And you'll often see them look to control the lead hand of their opponent. even though Ugas uses his lead hand a little bit less frequently, I believe that he is sharper and quicker on a one-punch basis, if you understand what I mean. So when he sets up that shot, he can let go like that, whereas Spence doesn't have that quickness, that edge. I believe Ugas is physically stronger and has a greater degree of physicality, and I believe that will play out in the fight. I think early on, you're going to see Ugas in his first kind of objective is to edge forward like he always does. I think he's going to look to put Errol Spence on the back foot. But I think Spence is a better and more well-rounded athlete. However, there is an elephant in the room that we must address, and it is the current condition of Errol Spence. Lest we forget that Spence had to pull out of the Pacquiao fight due to a retinal injury. And now, that is a severe, severe injury to have. That's such a delicate body part. And it's the kind of injury that has retired great fighters in the past. And now, I'm going to ask a question. Are we being led to believe that less than a year later, Spence's eye is now 100%? What other injuries may he have that he just hasn't disclosed? Because, of course, that retinal injury, assuming it's real, because, of course, fighters do fake injuries, but assuming it is real, and I think it's reasonable considering the crash, the horrendous crash that Errol Spence had. Fighters, you know, when going into the Manny Pacquiao fight, that was a high-profile fight. So he had to pull out with an injury. Everyone knows that now. This wasn't a small-time fight. This wasn't an early fight that kind of gets swept under the rug. And that fight was only supposed to happen in August. We're now in April 2022. Has his eye just miraculously healed all of a sudden? I think that's very unlikely. And as I say, he may have other injuries that he didn't disclose. And Spence himself has already admitted recently to having PTSD from that car crash. And so these are all very concerning questions surrounding Spence right now as he goes into what I believe and I anticipate will be his toughest fight to date. So I have flipped this fight around in my head like a pancake for days now. And for the longest time, I was confident, quite confident in picking Yordenis Ugas to win. And in case you haven't seen, I had my brother Henry boxing on the edge on a live stream on Monday, so a couple of days ago. And he was picking Ugas, split decision. And I was like, you know what? I think I'll pick with that one too. But yesterday I was watching the fights and I was like, you know what? Something tells me that Errol Spence, I think he's going to get a split decision. So I went from Ugas to Errol Spence, but now I'm going back to Ugas. So I'm gonna make my formal prediction. I believe that Yordenis Ugas beats Errol Spence by 12-round split decision. However, bearing in mind that I guess you could say that Spence is the name, I would not be surprised if Spence gets a split decision himself. I think the likelihood is that if this fight goes to points, it's going to be a split decision either way. In terms of a stoppage, I don't see Spence stopping Ugas, but I believe Ugas can stop Spence. And I see it being a weird stoppage where, imagine if Ugas just hits Spence with the right place on that eye and Spence just turns his back and isn't, you know, knocked out cold or anything, but he just feels something go wrong and he turns his back on the action. He's like, no, I can't do this. So those are the three outcomes I think are likely to happen. Spence SD, Ugas SD, or Ugas stoppage. But to nail my colours to the mast, I'm going to go with Ugas on a split decision. Just my opinion, however. Let me know yours in the comment section below. How do you see this fight going? Do you agree with my assessment? Do you disagree? And hopefully it's a good fight, first and foremost. So, yeah, let me know what you think in the comment section below, and I'll get back to you. Thanks for listening, as always. I'll catch you in the next video.